So we talked last time we met about crimes of the family, and we said that there were several. There was spousal abuse, child abuse, elder abuse, sibling abuse, and even parent abuse. And we're going to talk in detail about some of these going forward. We also said that the abuse can be physical, and that is to say, you can beat somebody up, or you can slap them around, or you can punch them. I'm not saying you should, but you can, and that would be considered physical abuse. There's also going to be neglect, and neglect means that you are responsible for a person. It could be a child, it could be an elderly parent. Whatever it is, you are taking on the caretaker role, and you have neglected that role such that the parent or the child doesn't get sufficient food. If it's a child, it doesn't get the appropriate education. You have neglected your duties as that caretaker. We also talked a little bit about emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, as you know, to my mind, is a little bit too subjective to be considered in law. We talked a little bit about the Piggy case in Massachusetts, where there were two teenage girls. The mother kept telling them, clean your rooms, clean your rooms, clean your rooms. They didn't. They left the house early on the weekend so that mom couldn't kind of trap them and say, all right, today is the day you're going to clean those rooms, darn it. So one day mother gets kind of clever, and she says, she gets up early and she stands in front of the bedroom doors when the girls, and she opens the door. She says, wake up, today is the day you're going to clean your rooms, you little pigs. Oh, and by the way, since you are little pigs, you're going to wear this little piggy nose. Now, there's nothing about the piggy nose that hurts them or anything. It's just a little bit humiliating. They are not doing this in front of other people. They're simply doing it at their own home. They clean their rooms. It might have taken an hour or two, and then they're free to go about their business. Well, in Massachusetts, the parents were charged by the Department of Social Services for emotional abuse of their children. I agree it's probably not your finest day as a parent when you do that, but although others might say it's very clever discipline, my concern, as I mentioned at that point, is where is that fine line between abuse, emotional abuse, and disciplining? You have that same with physical abuse. Is spanking abuse if it's used for proper discipline? But I think it's much more subjective when you talk about emotional abuse. Clearly, good parents are not going to call their children dumb all the time. But where does that become illegal versus just bad parenting? We also have sexual abuse. This can be sexual abuse of the vulnerable. In other words, it could be sexual abuse of children, which most of us would consider to be quite heinous. It could be emotional. It could be sexual abuse of an elderly person. This is something you see talked about on the media for nursing home staff and orderlies. Doesn't happen often, I'm sure, but when it does, it becomes a huge media frenzy simply because it is so appalling that most of us simply can't imagine that. There is a third type of sexual abuse, and that is rape. Now, rape in general certainly is wrong. It's a crime of power more than it is a crime of sex. But rape today can be considered to be a family, a domestic violence, because today the laws say that a man cannot force sexual attentions on his wife. This is a relatively new thinking in family law. Used to be in the, I want to say even up to the 1960s and 70s, a man kind of owned his wife. This was his property, much like his children were. And he was allowed to express his conjugal rights when he wished to do so. And even before that, those conjugal rights were even more strongly held in society. Today, we believe that sexual relations between a husband and his wife can be one. It should be consensual, But two, it can also rise to the level of rape if it's forced. Typically, you're not going to see sexual abuses like rape between a husband and wife if they're still married and in a happy relationship. Mostly you're going to see these kinds of charges are not going to make their way into the criminal justice system, and if they do, they're going to have to involve a great deal of violence, particularly for parties who are separated but still married. Lastly, we talked about financial abuse. This is going to be more likely to occur between a parent and a young child who is not a high income earner, like a prodigy, chess prodigy who makes money, or a child actor or actress where they're earning a lot of money. In the old days, the parent was allowed to exploit the earnings of their children and take it for their own. Today, there are laws that minimize that ability, and any child who is a high income earner like that, the parents must put a significant portion of that child's earnings into a trust. The other type of financial abuse can be financial abuse of the elderly. I gave you the story about my father and his home health care person. Typically, you're not going to find financial abuse between two adults who are married, and if that does occur, divorce laws are specific about who owns what in most states, whether they're community property or not. So again, with financial abuse, typically it's going to only today be financial abuse of the elderly. So we started talking about spousal abuse. We talked about how it was a hands-off situation up until the 80s, and that was because, again, constitutionally you have the right to privacy in your own home. That right to privacy was held sacred. Sorry, that's my little dog. That was held sacred by our Constitution, and the police abided by that. As there were more cases of police liability for failure to act, and that is to say, as there were many calls to the house, the police counseled only, and they said, all right, go in peace and God bless you. And later, after 5, 6, 7, or 8 calls, they did nothing other than, stop this fighting now and we'll go away. The woman died, and their estate sued the police department for failure to act. That and data on recidivism, and that is to say, husbands and wives tended to be not just one case, but they were continually being called to the house, or it just didn't end. So those two types of findings increased our awareness of spousal abuse, and it increased the police departments and the criminal justice systems' willingness to act on them, to take some action on them. Some of the new things in domestic violence as a result of getting rid of that hands-off policy and then taking a close look, especially by grant-giving agencies, where there was so much grant money available for domestic violence prevention programs. Some of the new trends, as we spoke about last week, were domestic violence prevention officers that were going to be housed within a police department. If you look up the Manchester, New Hampshire Police Department, you'll see that they have such a specialized unit. The other thing, and this is where we left off, was the willingness of courts to accept the battered spouse defense to murder, manslaughter, or assault. This came about as a result of the Lorena Bobbitt case, and you have an assignment, as you know, to Google Lorena Bobbitt and bring that to class. So I'll expect to see that on Thursday. But briefly, Lorena Bobbitt was a woman who claimed to have been beaten constantly by her husband. So she developed almost a sort of, and this is the thinking of psychologists, almost sort of post-traumatic stress disorder to it. And as a result, she became highly sensitized to any possibility so the theory goes, of being beaten by her husband. Well, one night, hubby comes home from his night out with the boys, a little bit on the drunken side. He comes home, he passes out in bed, and Lorena, who, according to the theory, is highly sensitized to the possibility of being beaten up, decides she's going to take care of this situation once and for all, and she takes a knife and she severs her husband's penis from his body. Now, she then goes on to say, well, he'll never see this again. I'm going to make sure of it because this is the thing that's causing me so much trouble. She gets in her car with the appendage. She drives, I don't know, miles. She throws it out the window only to come back. Her husband's now bleeding out. They arrest Lorena for assault with a deadly weapon on his organ. Now, Lorena was one of the first people to use this battered spouse defense, and she had psychologists and psychiatrists testifying in her case that said Lorena Bobbitt was so highly sensitized to abuse by her husband that she really wasn't in control of her right mind at the time, and as a result we ought to treat this leniently. Now, typically a self-defense claim, which you would have thought an abused spouse would use, typically a self-defense claim went something like this. Husband decides to beat the wife, he lands the first punch, and she, in order to defend herself, uses only enough force as is necessary, because he started it, only as much force as is necessary to stop his attack. Now those are some key words in the self-defense doctrine. It has to be started by the other party, the party not claiming self-defense as a defense to an action in court, and the victim may only use as much force as is necessary to stop the attack. So as an example, let's say that a wife was being beaten by her husband with his fists. He is somewhat taller and heavier than him, a little bit stronger. He's a little more strong, has greater musculature, and to defend herself, she takes out a knife and she says, "Come one step closer to me and I'm going to cut you." Now, that would be using only enough force as is necessary. If he does come one step closer, she can then use the knife. On the other hand, she can't whip out a gun because he's only using his fists and he's not that much bigger or in better shape. She can't shoot him because that's using more force than is necessary. Hence, there might be some questions in the mind of the jury on this about whether or not she can use the self-defense law. Instead, in Lorena's case, he was unconscious. He wasn't attempting to batter her at all. She's the one who takes the first step. So she's not so much the victim here as she is the person who is assaulting the husband. And yet she gets to use a variation on the self-defense claim in court. Now, this only happens when you use the battered spouse defense, because again, this defense says, even if the husband is not attacking at the moment, the woman or the victim is kind of so much out of his or her reality space that they're overly sensitive to anything and they react more strongly. Think of it this way in terms of being overly sensitive. Some people can sit in a chair, a boom can go off behind them, and they'll just continue on with that. That's probably me. Other people have a more heightened awareness. If a big bada-boom goes off behind them, they're going to jump and they're going to run all over the place. You can think of that as a person like Lorena, who's overly sensitive to the possibility of being beaten. She's going to go, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." So the battered spouse defense is something that's now allowed in court since Lorena Bobbitt as a defense against murder and manslaughter. This was very successful in Lorena's case, and she was found not guilty by virtue of having what's called an affirmative defense. And we'll talk about affirmative defenses versus other defenses when you're in criminal and procedural law. But basically, an affirmative defense says, all right, I did the deed. Okay, I am guilty of doing it, but I have a really good reason for why I did it. So in other words, I affirm I did it, but I have this really good justification for it. And in Lorena's case, the justification was, I kind of suffer from some variation of post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I have a heightened awareness of danger to me because I've been beaten up so often. So that was another new trend that came on the scenes. Yet a third new trend that came on the scenes was something called a presumptive arrest policy. And that is to say, many states have made it a law that if you get called to the scene of a domestic violence call, so somebody calls you and they say, hello, my name is Martha Smith. I can hear my neighbor next door. She's screaming, help, help, help. She and her husband are always fighting, but now it sounds like it's going too far. So the dispatcher says, all right, we'll dispatch somebody to you, and a police officer goes to your location. He now, if the presumptive arrest policy is in force in that state, must make an arrest no matter what. And this is very different from what it used to be, where law enforcement officers would be called to the scene of a domestic violence situation, say in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they would simply try to counsel people and say, all right, separate for the moment, you go on about your business, no arrests. Very different from that, because we're now today more sensitized to some of the problems of domestic violence. And so some states have implemented this presumptive arrest policy, and it can take on two different flavors. One flavor says, if you get called to the scene of a domestic violence incident, you arrest the person who appears to be the victim. You arrest the person who appears to be the perpetrator, and the victim isn't arrested. Now, there have been some concerns about that, and again, if you think back to the self-defense situation, where you can only employ the self-defense affirmative defense if the other person was the one to institute the negative exchange. You can't, if the victim started it and he's the one who gets beaten up more, then he can't claim that. So consistent with that thinking, presumptive arrest policy said, well, how do we know when we get to the scene of domestic violence who was the one who started it? We know the one who looks the most beaten up, but maybe, just maybe, it was the other person who started it. So in those states which took a second look at it, in light of the affirmative defense of self-defense, those states made a presumptive arrest policy that said, when you're called to the scene of a domestic violence incident, you arrest both parties, and we'll let the judge figure it out as it goes into court. And all the rules of the adversarial policy of courtroom behavior then, and assistance from an attorney, all that stuff comes into play, and we're more likely to get the right answer about who should be charged and who shouldn't be, rather than having a law enforcement officer make the call at the scene of the crime. So those are some new situations in domestic violence. And by the way, if you're very interested in domestic violence, being a law enforcement specialist in this might be something that you would be interested in, because it includes not just spousal abuse, but abuse of a child as well. And frankly, you'll make a lot more money in terms of a career if you work as a police officer than if you work as a child abuse specialist in counseling in most states, certainly in Massachusetts, which is where I come from. So let's talk a little bit more after that aside about the presumptive arrest policy. This came from research that was conducted in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This was funded by the National Institute of Justice. And again, as I said, there's a lot of grant money for research and for implementing research or proof-based programs available from the National Institute of Justice, from COPS, that's community-oriented policing, that can fund some of these initiatives for cities, for city law enforcement or even sheriff's department. Anyway, this comes from a National Institute of Justice funded study, and in this case, the police in Minneapolis were told that they would not just counsel, but that they would have to arrest. The result of this was that the recidivism for domestic violence offenses dropped. And by that I mean there were fewer repeat performances. If somebody was arrested for it, that person was more likely to no longer engage in domestic violence. This set the stage for presumptive arrest policies in a lot of states. The problem with this was that subsequent studies, and here's the watchword anytime you want to do research, is replication, replication, replication. So the National Institute of Justice funded 6 replications of the Minnesota study. These replications didn't find an overall effectiveness in the state or wherever it was implemented. Instead, they found out that it was mostly effective for employed, married, and white men. Why is this so? Well, it comes from the notion that these are the people who are bonded in, the mainstream goals of our society. And you'll remember that we talked about this whole theory about social bonding. If you are bonded with society, you will obey those unwritten social norms. If you're a guy with a middle-class job, you have to go to work every day, and it's a middle-class kind of job, you're not working like at a car wash or something. You go into work, you've missed work for a couple of days while you're incarcerated, and the boys say, how come you missed work? And you say, oh, I was arrested for beating my wife. You won't get a lot of attaboys from your peeps. In fact, what will happen to middle-class white married men is you'll be ostracized for that. It's considered to be quite deplorable, not just to beat your wife, but to be arrested and then to have to go to court for this. The flip side of that is that for men who were unemployed, who didn't have that stake in society or didn't have that bond in society, arrest was not effective. In fact, what happened was they went back, they were arrested, they went back to their peeps, and their peeps would say, oh, maybe they were at a car wash, or maybe they were kind of like drug dealers, low level or whatever. Their peeps would say, hey man, I haven't seen you for a while, what up? And the guy would say, I beat the old lady because she wasn't doing what I told her to do, and I got arrested for it. Hey, you know what that happens? And the boys are going to do this. That's right, man. You got to make the old lady do what you say, because that's the unwritten rule or the social norm among that group of people. So in this case, arrests for domestic violence actually increase the violence. And again, it has a lot to do with how bonded people are. And again, remember that social bonding theory, how bonded people are with mainstream social goals versus bonded with a subculture of violence or a street subculture. And again, it's sort of like being in school. If you are in the clique that says we're the bad boys, and you get an A, straight A's in your on your report card in high school, that's not something you're going to brag about, because you're going to be made fun of. You're going to be dissed. Nobody's going to think that's cool. So too are these unemployed street guys not going to brag about keeping, being a good husband and, financially supporting their women. That's not what their society, their subculture is about. It's about, keeping the old lady in hand, making sure she doesn't get, think too much of herself. That's the kind of thing that your peeps, your peers, are going to applaud, and you're going to get a lot of attaboys for that, not the, good earning A student kind of thing. One of the big issues in domestic violence, spousal abuse, and by the way, I just want to reiterate that spousal abuse is not just abuse from a man against a woman. We talked about spousal abuse as possibly being spousal abuse by a woman against a man. Now, remember my student from University of Massachusetts who went on ride along. She said she came to a domestic violence incident and saw that they picked up a man who had, I want to say, 17 stab wounds, and the wife had nothing. These are going to be things that will be very underreported. So in the official statistics, you'll see mostly man against wife in spousal abuse, or male domestic partner against female domestic partner. So why don't they leave? That's the question on everybody's mind. And I don't believe that we've come up with one perfect answer. Some possible answers are, and I'll tell you which one I think is correct. First of all, psychologists would say that the women have poor self-esteem, and they go into these relationships and they stay in these relationships because they feel that nobody else will have them. So you're a person with poor self-esteem, you're just glad somebody, some male married you. It's like, oh, yay. And I'm not going to do anything to rock the boat to get him to leave. If he wants to beat me, well, then I must have been bad. Because again, remember, the theory is bad self-esteem. And I'm not going to think I was the good person. No, it must be my partner, my male partner. So that's one theory about why the abused partner or spouse doesn't leave. A little orange juice for me. Another theory is that the abused spouse has been kept so isolated by their partner. And by the way, isolation from others is one of the hallmarks of abusive spouses. They want to keep their victim isolated from others who might influence them or give them an out or say, why do you take that? So they will begin to isolate their victim from other friends. They keep them in the house. They don't want the wife or the partner to go out and see their friends. So they're isolated, and as a result, this no resources theory says, well, the woman has children. She has no possibility of a job. So how is she going to feed and house her children? I have to say this to that theory, today at least. Today, there are many battered women's shelters that will take victims of domestic violence and their children. Those battered women's shelters will set the woman up, or the battered man, if I want to be free from gender bias, will set their victim up with other community resources, including job training, and help to provide a job for that person so that they can, in fact, become self-sufficient. Add to that what most states have and call transitional assistance, means that if you have a family, particularly children and dependents, and you cannot temporarily support them, you can get some sort of funding from the government temporarily. That's why it's called transitional, because as you go from dependent to independent, this transitional assistance will help guide your way, and that includes money for your day-to-day living needs as well as training. So with respect to that, I'm not so much of a believer in the no resources theory. Add to that an article in the news that I saw, sorry, that was my big dog, that I saw years ago, which may take this no resources and put it into more of an emotional thing rather than just only an intellectual place. This woman and her children left an abusive spouse. The woman's family had resources, so they set her up in a fairly nice apartment. They helped her get free of the husband. She was where he didn't know how to find her. And by the way, today, most battered women services will include services not only that will help the woman file for a restraining order, but help them remain sort of invisible to the batterer by virtue of giving them a post office box that people can send mail to, and then that mail will be forwarded to her permanent address so she can stay anonymous. In any case, this woman had remained invisible to her spouse, her battering spouse. She had a job, she had a nice apartment, and for some reason, which is not clear to me how this happened, she apparently kept going to some of her old habitual places, like maybe where she used to shop. She runs into this spouse. He says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, sorry, blah, 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 please forgive me." She believes this. She gives him access to where she lives. She gives him her address and phone number. They decide that they're going to reunite. She accepts this. He eventually, from this, now she's totally rid of him, she accepts him back into her life, and he kills her. So, to me, all these things add up to the no resources explanation as being kind of irrelevant and not a very good explanation for why they don't leave. The third one is expectations from from your family of origin. Now here, your family of origin are your mom and dad. So if I'm a battered spouse, my mother and father, my family of origin, would also have been abusive, and that is to say, my dad would have been abusive to my mother. I would have seen that, and I would have expected, I would have internalized that with the thinking that, well, that's just normal, that's how people live, there's nothing wrong with that. Although my slide says this is 2 theories, there are actually 3, and I'm sorry I didn't add that to the slide. The first theory that fits with this is Bandura's behavior modeling. I am the child, I see daddy beating mommy. I say, oh, this is the way I model mommy. This is the way families live. And chances are others of my acquaintance do this as well. This is just the norm. So I, as a woman, am going to expect that, and I will model my behavior after mommy, and that is to say, I will become a punching bag for daddy. That's the way marriage is. No other explanations. So that's Bandura's behavior modeling theory. It can also be explained by Sutherland's Differential Association theory, and that is to say, if I grow up in a family where daddy abuses mommy, physically abuses mommy, this is what I know. One of the factors, remember there are 4 factors in differential association that increases the likelihood of learning a behavior. One is priority, what you learn first. Certainly, I'm learning first that daddy abuses mommy, he beats her up. That's normal. Intensity, obviously I'm going to have a very intense relationship with my family of origin. Duration, long term. My family of origin is going to have control over me from the age of 0, something I learn in utero. And by the way, If a husband beats his wife while she's pregnant, there have been studies now that say that the fetus can actually learn from what goes on in the mother's environment. And I guess also you have to include stress in there. And when we talked about the teratogenetic effects of stress, we talked about those as being quite significant and long-lasting in the fetus as it is born, as it's an infant, and as it grows from childhood to adulthood. So here's my differential association. I have the factors that are going to say, this is what I will learn. This is what my subculture says is how we live. And that's likely to color my vision or my view of what is normal in a family. So if this is what I know, my husband beats me up, well, that's what I know is normal, and I accept that, and nothing else will tell me different. I might go to a therapist, and that therapist will tell me, lady, you got to get out of this situation, and intellectually I may accept this, but in my gut, from all that prior learning, it's not going to connect, and I will simply put up with it. Last but not least of the three, we know subcultural theory, what you grow up with. People who grow up with spouse battering are often in a lower class, let's not even say working class, but lower class subculture where this is the norm not only among mommy and daddy, but among everybody else in the neighborhood. These are the guys who are going to work at, maybe if we're lucky, at a car wash and move from job to job. It is an accepted norm in that subculture that the husband or the male partner will beat the wife to keep the old lady in line. So those again say your expectations of normal, this is not the new normal, this is the old normal. Your expectations of normal are that, yes, this will happen to me. I expect it, I accept it, and this is how people live. This will be in your gut no matter what somebody else tells you as being different. So, last but not least, we have the expectation of battering being reciprocal. This is something that I found very interesting as an explanation for spousing battle. And it's something that was raised in a book that Eve Bizawa, who is chairperson of the Criminology and Criminal Justice Department at the University of Massachusetts. And I know her because we used to work together. And in addition to that, I know her husband, Carl, who is an attorney who worked at Textron Defense Systems. So it's always a small world. Anyway, Bizawa in her work cites this explanation and this research. She calls it the battle of dueling spouses, and says that in these relationships, both parties, both the husband and the wife, are involved in making the fight happen. It doesn't happen just because the husband is abusive, but that the wife does something to, if not elicit it, at least not to stop it. And I'll give you this example from my own family. My great-grandmother was probably less than my size, so let's put her at 4'10". She was a little Irish Asian lady. She married a German man, and very tall. They were farmers. He was abusive. He would, not always, but only when he would drink. This is a family story that was handed down through the ranks of women in my family, and I heard this from my grandmother. So the story goes, he came home one night and he was drunk, and he beat her. And because she was not one who accepted this, because she wasn't part of this dueling spouses duality or coupling, she said, "Not me, buddy." And the next time he came home drunk and passed out, she tied him up, and when he woke up the next morning, she took the buggy whip. Now you have to understand that this was pre-automobile. So the buggy whip was a long whip that would be used when you're driving a team of horses attached to a cart. And it wasn't really used to hit the horse, but to make a good sort of popping sound. Anyway, she took this buggy whip, not so much the string attached to it, but the actual whip, and let's put it this way, kind of spanked him with it enough so that he was not a happy man, plus the hangover couldn't have made him too happy, and left some good bruises on it. And she said to him these words, "Do this to me ever again and count on this being worse." And family legend has it that going forward he never drank another drop, and they lived, if not happily ever after, the two of them remained pretty bruise-free after, until they both died. So that's one example of how one spouse can say, "No, sorry, not going to take it," or leaving. Another example, and this is probably more of what Bazawa had in mind, is that in one case, one partner has abusive tendencies, and the other partner kind of eggs him on. So here is the scenario, and I'm going to use the Byrne-Ziti case. This is a case that happened in Massachusetts. The husband came home. His expectation was that the wife would have a good dinner on the table for him when he returned, because she didn't work. All she had to do, and I'm saying all in air quotes, was take care of the house and children. So he comes home expecting this really good dinner, and she makes ziti with pasta sauce. Unfortunately, as she's making the ziti, her mind goes somewhere else and she burns the ziti. This is why it's called the Byrne-Ziti case. And he beats the crap out of her because she burned the ziti, which is a type of pasta. It's a little round pasta. Now, let me extrapolate from that and show you how we can twist this into Bazawa's Battle of the Dueling Spouses. She burns the ziti. He goes, "Blah, blah, blah, bleep, 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 bleep. You burned the blah, 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 bleeping spaghetti again. You're no good, blah, blah, blah." Now, it could stop there, or the wife could start becoming argumentative and escalating this by doing, "Oh, well, you know what, you're really not worth cooking for, and you know what, you're ugly, and your mother wears combat boots," and so on and so forth. So the person against whom this abuse is being directed has the opportunity to escalate it or de-escalate it. This is something that we'll also talk about in Intro to Criminal Justice, how a police officer can escalate a situation or de-escalate it. In this case, the wife, because this is what she has learned marriages are, escalates it. And pretty soon it results in fisticuffs. We all know that in general most men are stronger than most women, and while the woman may be punching him, the person more likely to be bruised is not going to be the husband, but it'll be the wife, simply because of the husband's superior strength in general. So she'll bear the marks and appear to be, I don't want to say appear to be, but her appearances will scream victim, where in fact, had she learned to de-escalate and kind of swallow her pride, this wouldn't have happened. So here are some statistics that come from an experimental design where the abused person was taught to do one of several things, which is to, 1, ignore it, 2, try to de-escalate, or 3, to herself engage in serious violence. Recidivism for the male spouse, if the wife did nothing. She swallowed her pride and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, dear, for the Byrne-Ziti, it'll never happen again." In this case, only 6% of the men recidivated. That's tiny, 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 tiny. So that's, by recidivate, again, I mean that they didn't engage in spousal violence. When the wife used minor violence in response to some kind of starting of a fight, let's say I'm the spouse, my husband's like, you can't cook, Sadie, blah, 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 blah. You're the most worthless piece of you know what, blah, blah, blah. And now instead of swallowing my pride and saying, oh, dear, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, which, you know, if you grow up in a household and you learn that the wife doesn't sit and take a back seat, you might say, all right, I'm going to say something like, all right, you blah, 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 husband, slap. Once that slap happens, it is a minor violence which propels the husband into using increasing force. This escalates the situation. In cases like this, the husbands recidivate, 23% of the husbands recidivated and used violence against their female partner again. You can't see this too well because of my slides, but it's 42% recidivism when the wife engaged in serious violence. So here, husband said, blah, 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 burns Edie, worthless wife, blah, blah, blah. And we start fighting and arguing, and it escalates until finally I get out the kitchen knife and I stab him. And the husband says, well, what the huh? This isn't going to happen. And he beats her up really more seriously. Here, the wife used more serious violence in response to an escalating argument. And in these cases, the husband recidivated. 42% of the husbands recidivated. Now, what is the learning we can take away from this? The learning is that when, assuming you believe these studies, and this is one of the few sources of empirical data that I've actually ever found in terms of treatment for spousal abuse. Empirical data means actual real numbers, not somebody's gut hunch, as is this poor self-esteem thing. And again, I'm not saying women don't have poor self-esteem, but which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Same thing with no resources. Here, this gives us some data to say, well, regardless of where this problem started, what can we do to stop it? We don't want to, put the woman into 30 years of Freudian counseling, or the husband. What can we do to stop it quickly? From Bazawa's research that she cited, the what can we do to stop this quickly says put both parties, the husband and the wife, in mandatory counseling, maybe not together at first, but give them both de-escalation tools, including the wife. Give her tools to de-escalate the violence. Once she has those tools, you'll see that the men are much more likely to decrease. Should it have to be that way? Should the wife have to take the onus for that? Is that fair? Probably not. But is it effective? Yes. I remember when I was getting married, and this was in 1969. My mother-in-law took me aside and she said, people often ask me what the secret to my long and happy marriage with Earl was. That's her husband, my father-in-law. And I always tell them this. The secret to my long and happy marriage is that I always let Earl think he's the boss. Hint to Cheryl, always let Bob think he's the boss. Is it fair? Probably not. Did it work for her? Probably. So, like the battling of dual spouse research says, is that life is not fair, but if you want to have this marriage work, you need to learn to finesse this particular type of husband. Now, I never had to do that with Bob, and he's a very modern kind of guy, and he does accept me as an equal, but this was not something that was true for people in my parents' generation or my in-laws' generation. My mother was very much a backseat wife and didn't know how to, she wouldn't have even called a plumber or a tradesman because that was quote-unquote daddy's job. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, pretty much wore the pants in the family in terms of making decisions, but that's not because she said to her husband, we will do this, we will move here, we will do that. but it's because she finessed her husband, which in that day and age was necessary if you wanted to be part of the decision making. Okay. Moving on here. Last but not least, let's talk about after separation, if the husband and the wife do separate. One of the big concerns about separation, and one of the reasons a lot of wives say they won't leave their husband, is because they fear retaliation for that and an escalation in violence. What happens, the research shows that if the woman leaves and the husband is indeed arrested and prosecution is likely to occur, any escalation in violence on his part occurs during the pendency and prosecution. So what I mean by this is Harry and Sally are married. This sounds like a movie. When Harry and Sally, when Harry left Sally, I don't know what the name of that movie is. But Harry and Sally are married. He beats her up. Police come. They arrest, mandatory arrest for Harry, and he's now in the pokey, and he's released on his own recognizance or on bail, and he doesn't live with Sally anymore. During the time between his release and the time that the trial occurs, and there's usually a long time between the act and the trial, it could be up to a year, Harry says to himself, shoot, I don't want Sally to be a witness. I'm going to threaten her. If you bear witness against me in the court of law, I'm going to not only punch you, I'm going to shoot you. So that's what I mean by during the pendency of prosecution, while we're waiting for the prosecution to happen. So most of the escalation of violence or threats of violence occur during the time between the arrest and when the trial occurs. Most of the people who say that, most of the husbands or the partners who say, I'm going to kill you or whatever, it's just a threat. However, 30% of them actually carry through on their threat. And that's even if there has been a stop against their behavior, a no contact order or something of that sort. If they escalate the violence during the pendency of the prosecution, they usually do it either to coerce the victim into a reconciliation. Why they'd want to reconcile with somebody that they beat up, I don't know. Or to retaliate against the wife for even initiating the prosecution or for leaving them. Or to coerce them into terminating the prosecution. To say, hands off, I'm not going to do it. Okay, I won't bear witness. And this is one of the reasons that presumptive arrest policy came through, is because then, if a state had a presumptive arrest policy where there must be an arrest even if the wife doesn't want it, she's then called she's subpoenaed as a witness to court, and she can be, even if she's unwilling to testify, the prosecutor can treat her as a hostile witness, which allows them a certain latitude in their interviewing or their cross-examination techniques or their examination techniques. The wife then doesn't become the party against whom retaliation is going to be targeted. Boy, that didn't sound very well. And so they're not going to try, the husband is not going to try to coerce the victim into terminating, because the victim doesn't have the power to do that. I think this might be enough, but let me just see what the next slide says. Oh, yes, I do want to talk about fatality review boards. A fatality review board is when a spousal abuse situation ends up in the death of one of the parties, so a fatality. A fatality review board means that some board of people review what happened and why. And these people will develop a statistical database on what happened that took this situation from an abuse, an ordinary garden variety of spousal abuse to spousal murder. So they will, from the records on the prior, let's call them prior calls for domestic violence to the police and any kind of counseling that they've received, they will collect data on when did they get services, when were the police called, what was the result of that, when the abuse occurred, did it occur when the husband was mostly drunk, did it occur on weekends, so on and so forth. What kind of services were requested for the parties? Were therapy or counseling services requested? Did the woman go into a battered shelter home, and did she leave it? So what services were requested, or were there no services requested by the domestic violence police specialist or whoever deals with this? Were there any barriers to the receipt of service? So for this barriers, what I mean is, let's say that the wife can get free counseling and the husband can get free counseling. A barrier to getting that service might be things like the husband works and counseling is only available during the day, and he doesn't want to say to his boss, I have mandatory counseling to go to because I beat my wife, or he doesn't want to take sick time. So that would be a barrier to a person getting available services. Another barrier might be money. Maybe it costs money to get this. A third barrier might be transportation. Maybe the services, let's take a rural area like I live in right now. I live in Horseshoe Bend. It's got 2 stores. It's got, so 2 stores. It's got the Dollar General and a grocery store. That's it. It's got an office for the police department. You can bet your bottom dollar that there is no therapist, no counseling, no nothing in Horseshoe Bend. If I am a person who is, let's say, poor and doesn't own a car, and I have counseling services available to me in an adjacent larger city, let's make it Batesville, but I don't have a car, how do I get there? So that's a barrier to service, is transportation. Now out here, there would be no public transportation to get to. So what are those barriers to the receipt of available services? And based on this database that's being developed, what can we do? What are the barriers? When do they occur? Is there any kind of pattern? Are there available services at all? More than half of the states in the United States are beginning to require such boards, so that a national database on the cause of domestic violence related fatalities is beginning to develop, and hopefully we will begin to see some patterns in nationwide fatalities as well as patterns by state, because again, each state is going to have a somewhat different culture. Oops. Your task, should you choose to accept it, is going to be to type up notes from this lecture and email it to me. The email is cheryl.peterson@uaccb.edu. Email it to me as an attached document by the end of class on Tuesday, and that will be your attendance. So that will be, and it's also a 5-point task. That will be Cheryl, CHERYL, Peterson, PETERSEN, @uaccb.edu. 5 points, count them 5, or 0 if you don't do it, and attendance. That's what I call a good deal. Thanks. Hope you enjoyed this videotaped lecture, and I will see you in class, in person, on campus, yes, on Thursday, when we will continue on with this story of domestic violence.